So my name's Lauren Kerrison. I'm the Work Health and Safety Facilitator for the Tasmanian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. I've only been working here for about 2 months, but I've got around 6 or 7 years in work health and safety, so mostly in manufacturing. Now this role's been really good so far, and I thought that I'd start my first webinar for the Work Health and Safety Essentials for new or small businesses. So this is a lot of information all at once, but what it was designed to do is to have a bit of an introduction into work health and safety. And if there's any of the topics throughout that we're going through, which I'll press onto the next page, any of these topics that really you're looking for further information on, we do training sessions on each of these topics as well. So we can go into more details on all of those. So we've only got an hour and I really wanted to take up, 40 to 45 minutes. So there was some time for questions. But yes, again, it'll only be a couple slides on each topic. And then if you are interested in more information, I'll let you know about the other trainings that we can offer. So the contents of this training, we've got legislative requirements. So that is the beginning of the slide. We've got work health and safety management systems, emergency plans, first aid requirements, risk assessments, incident reports and managements, a bit on training and competency, consultation and communication, workplace inspections and electrical safety. So it is a bit going on, but we'll go through the slides. And if you do have any questions throughout, please feel free to unmute and ask them throughout the slide. I will ask that everyone, if you don't mind, please unmute at the moment, unless you do have a question. So we'll get started. Everyone can see the slide okay? Haven't heard otherwise. So let's start with legislation. So it's necessary evil, something that we'll have to go through. So it's broken up into 5 areas. So we've got our acts and regulations, which are law, so they're legislative. And in Tasmania, we've got the Work Health and Safety Act 2012 and the Regs 2012. So that's our Tasmanian current legislation for work health and safety. So that is legislative. Then we've got our codes of practice, Australian standards and industry standards and guidance tools. So they're not necessarily legislation, but they are legislative if they are mentioned in the Work Health and Safety Acts and Regulations. So I know this is a lot of words and the first 3 or 4 slides are about legislation, so just bear with me. But basically with codes of practice, you're looking at examples are confined space, construction, demolition, first aid in the workplace, hazardous manual tasks. So all of those as a whole may not be legislative, but if it is specifically mentioned in there that it refers to the law, then it is legislative. Your codes and practice are accessible on Safe Work Australia, and they're all free. So I recommend that you do have a read through any that are relevant to your industry. But that's the general pyramid on our work health and safety legislation. Then our legislation is broken down into 4 duty holders. So we've got a PCBU, which stands for person conducting the business or undertaking. So it's basically the owner of the business. Then you've got an officer. That can be your management, your supervisors. Then you've got workers. So they're your general workers and volunteers. And then there are other. So the reason that's mentioned on here is just, I imagine we've got a couple different duty holders that have joined today on the webinar, but basically it's good just to have a high level understanding of what the duty holders are under our current legislation. So under our Act, the person with management or control of the workplace, so that's the PCBU, needs to, so far as is reasonably practicable, ensure that the workplace meets all the relevant legislation. So they are the ultimate duty holder. And what that means is, so your duty of care is your legal duty to take reasonable care so that others aren't harmed at work. So it is the employer's responsibility to ensure that all reasonably practical measures have been taken to control risks against all possible injuries arising from the workplace. So again, bear with me with the first few slides, guys. So more words. Further to that, so the last slide was around the PCBU, so the owner of the business. You then have officers, so they're your managers, your supervisors, your coordinators, your business professionals. So they have a lot of duties, and their ultimate duty is to ensure that the PCBU is complying with legislation. So, for example, the main duty of the duty of the officers are to exercise due diligence. So due diligence is to acquire and keep up-to-date knowledge of work health and safety matters. It's to gain an understanding of the nature and the operations of the business and to have a general understanding of the hazards. So you don't want a manager in a workplace that has, no idea about the operations and machinery that you're using, even if it's customer service or anything. So they need to have a general understanding of the business and how it operates and their hazards. To ensure that the PCBU has available for use the appropriate resources and processes to eliminate and minimise risk to health and safety. Further to that, it's also to ensure that they've got a process in place for incident and hazard and risk management. Last but not least, they also have to ensure that the PCBU has and implements processes for complying with any duty or obligation under the legislation. So a lot of words there. And if you are interested in learning more about our current work health and safety legislation, we do have a training session on that as well. One goes for 2 hours and one goes for 4 hours. So this is everyone's duty. So everyone is considered at a minimum a worker under the legislation in Tasmania. So while at work, a worker must take reasonable care of his or her own health and safety, take reasonable care that his or her acts or omissions do not adversely affect the health and safety of others, to comply so far as reasonably practicable with any reasonable instruction that is given by the PCBU, and further to that also to cooperate with any reasonable policy and procedure. So that in simple terms means, for example, your workplace might have a drug and alcohol policy, so 0 alcohol, 0 drugs. It's a reasonable policy and procedure for a worker to comply with that. That is reasonable. What would not be reasonable is if you asked a worker to work at heights without any fall arrest or working at heights equipment. That therefore is not a reasonable thing for you to ask a worker to do, so they can refuse to do that. But under legislation, they need to look after their own health and safety. They need to ensure that their acts don't affect other people in an unsafe manner, and they need to comply with what you're reasonably asking them to do. So this is all under legislation. And it's a really good training session for workers to go through as well. All right, I believe this is my last slide on legislation. So what is really important as a business owner or a manager or a supervisor or any of those titles, even as a worker, is to understand what is reasonably practicable. So this is a word used in the legislation a lot and in risk assessments. And we'll just read the definition and then we'll go through a bit more what that means. So in the Act, reasonably practicable in relation to a duty to ensure health and safety means that which is or was at a particular time reasonably able to be done in relation to ensuring health and safety, taking into account and weighing. So you want to ensure that the likelihood of the hazard or the risk concerned occurring and the degree of harm that might result from a hazard or the risk, what the person concerned knows or ought to reasonably know, the hazard or the risk, ways of implementing or minimising the risk, the availability and suitability of ways to eliminate and minimise the risk, and after assessing the extent of the risk and the available ways of eliminating or minimising the risk, the costs associated with the available ways of eliminating it. So a lot of words there, but if you look over to the photo on the right, you've got risk on one side and cost and benefit on the other side. So basically with risk, what is the severity of the risk and how likely is it to occur versus the cost, so money, time, effort and capability. So if you had a risk of people getting paper cuts on a copy machine and the way to eliminate that was to automate the system and it cost $1 million, your cost then would outweigh the risk. So it wouldn't really be a reasonably practicable solution to spend that amount of money to reduce paper cuts in the workplace. But say you had a risk of a potential manual handling injury, you've got people lifting 30 kilos, 20 times a minute or something like that, that risk is quite high. You're pretty likely going to get a manual handling injury, and the cost could be to automate the process $100,000, for example. So your cost benefit with your risk, it evens out, and that would be considered reasonably practicable in that sense. So I hope that I haven't lost you guys yet on the legislation part. Are there any questions yet at all? No? Okay, we'll keep going through. So as a business PCB or officer, we need to ensure that we've got some work health and safety management systems in place, or that we're working towards getting them in place. And it does depend on your industry and what you would be required to have. But a workplace health and safety management system is a set of policies, procedures and plans that systemically manage health and safety at work and can help to minimise the risk of injury and illness in the workplace. So the TCCI can offer what's called a work health and safety diagnostic audit, and that is free of charge as well. And basically we can just audit your business current framework and just see if there are any opportunities. So some examples of work health and safety management systems are, you've got your work health and safety policy. So that will be, for example, us as a business comply to ensure we meet current legislation, that we're keeping people safe at work, that we're following up on incidents and near miss, things like that. Incident response policy, so that's a pretty common one for big industries. Risk management policy, drug and alcohol policy, contractor management policy, emergency response procedures, and things like that. So they're just examples of management systems, and their policies and procedures, especially if you've opened a new business, that you should look at starting to get them into place. But again, the TCCI can offer help and do a diagnostic audit with you to figure out where your gaps are in your business. Okay. So emergency plans. So these are really important, whether or not your business is open to the public or not, to have an emergency plan visually in place so that people, if they have wandered into your business or it is public, know where to evacuate, where they are, and the process that is required for the industry that you're in. So a compliant evacuation diagram must be orientated with a UR here. So you can see in this example here, you've got a "You are here" sticker. You can see where the exits are. You can see the layout of the building. You can see the assembly point. All the exits are named, the location of the fire equipment, so that's really important. You can see where all the fire extinguishers are, even the first aid equipment, which is also really important. Fire stairs, if it's relevant, escape routes, and it's also a really good idea to have where your northern point is, which is also on this diagram here. So this is just a fortifier. There's heaps of examples out there. A lot of businesses already have them in place, but it's an easy thing to improve as well, because a lot of them don't have everything that you should have on the emergency evacuation plan as well. When you're doing an emergency evacuation plan, if you haven't got one at all, it is always a good idea to engage your local fire brigade and ask them for help on where they believe your emergency exit point should be and things like that. Also, if we go back to work health and safety management plans, if you do have a evacuation policy, that's also good, because there's not only fire emergencies, there can be security threat, a bomb threat, things like that. So they require different emergency procedures as well. So again, it depends on the industry that you're working in or your business, but at a minimum, you should at least be having a fire evacuation plan up on the wall in the common areas so people can see where they need to evacuate. Also should be a part of your induction if you're inducting someone, so they know where to evacuate. Okay. So first aid requirements. There is a code of practice that's free of charge to access, so just type into Google code of practice first aid in the workplace and it will come up. But this is basically what it says on there. So first aid in the workplace can be provided in two ways. So you either have it internally, so you have your own workers trained on how to perform first aid, or you arrange for a person who does not work for you to administer first aid to your workers, provided they've been trained to do so. So it is recommended that you have your own first aiders, but if you were next door to a hospital or a GP clinic or something along those lines, you may not need to. The following ratios are recommended on the codes of practice as well. So a low risk workplace, one first aider for every 50 workers. So, an example of a low risk workplace could potentially be an office environment or, something along those lines. A high risk workplace would require one first aider for every 25 workers. So that could be, manufacturing environments, things like that. Remote high risk work, that's mines, places along those lines, one first aider for every 10 workers. So this is straight out of the codes of practice. And it is a great idea to have your own first aiders available. Further to that, you'll also require, depending on whether you go with option 1 or 2, to have your own first aid kits available at your workplace as well. And the reason there's a photo of a car on here is because a portable first aid kit should be provided in vehicles for mobile workers. So if you've got a career like a courier, a taxi driver, sales rep, bus driver, inspectors, it's a really great idea to have a portable first aid kit in their car, because it is a part of their workplace. So first aid kits should be in an area where they can be easily located. They should be stocked every 6 to 12 months or after an incident, after they're used. So that's the basics on your first aid requirements. Incident reporting. So this ties up neatly with the first aid before. So all hazards, near misses, injuries, property damage or fatalities must be reported at work. You need to ensure you have an incident reporting system in place for your employees. So this is a part of your work health and safety management system. Incident reports should include the name of the injured person, the date and time, location, type of injury and bodily location and incident description. So that's at a minimum. You can also add, witnesses, incident investigation, supervisor details. You can add a lot of things to an incident report. It all depends on your business and also the degree of harm. But if you do have a first aid kit and people are using it, you need to ensure they're putting in a first aid report, an incident report for their first aid injury. So that way you can track why has the incident happened and what can we do to fix it. So incident report forms can be found, templates online very easily. But again, if you want any help setting up an incident report form, just pop your hand up and I'm more than happy to help you, and the TCCI is. But very important to make sure that you are gathering your incident reports, because if it came down to a workers' compensation claim and you don't have any records of the incident occurring, it gets really messy. So we need to make sure that we're reporting things as they happen. Further to incident reporting, under legislation, there's also what's called a notifiable incident. So a notifiable incident needs to be notified to WorkSafe Tasmania, and it can be notified to them via phone call, email, or they've got an incident report form on their website. And examples, or the ones that you must report, are the death of a person, a serious injury or illness, or a dangerous incident. So an incident is not notifiable just because it happens at the workplace. To be notifiable, it must be work related. So a non-work related example would be a heart attack at work, for example, not necessarily work related. But if you had a serious injury occur, so someone was driving a forklift and they were involved in an accident and they got a serious injury, it's a notifiable incident. It needs to be notified straight to WorkSafe. So if you go on WorkSafe TAS's website and just look up notifiable incident, it goes through really great details on what a serious injury or illness is. An example of what a serious injury or illness is, let's have a look. Immediate treatment as an inpatient in hospital. If there's an amputation, head injury, serious eye injury or burn, medical treatment being required within 48 hours. So that's an example of a serious injury or illness. And some examples of a dangerous incident. So that doesn't necessarily mean they're injured, just had the potential to injure them. So an electric shock, uncontrolled escape of, water, liquids, mud, anything like that. Confined space incidents, car accident, near misses, so excavation, things like that. But again, if you really want to read through it, go on the WorkSafe Tasmania website and it'll go through in great detail on what is notifiable. And if it is on the serious end, you need to be giving them a phone call, not an email or an incident report form or anything along those lines. Any questions so far? What will happen if you have a notifiable incident is an inspector will get in contact with you and you'll need to preserve the scene if it is serious. So if you've got a death, a serious injury or dangerous incident, you need to ensure that no one's near the area where it occurred. Put some hazard tape around it, ensure that you have a conversation with WorkSafe before you go back into that area again. Okay, so consultation and communication. So this is, I'll read through what's on the slide. So consultation is a two-way process between you and your workers where you talk to each other about health and safety matters, listen to their concerns and raise your concerns, seek and share views and information, and consider what your workers say before you make decisions. So that's straight out of the Work Health and Safety Act. This is a really important way to improve your safety culture at work. Instead of just making decisions without consulting with your workers, if they're involved in the decision or have a chance to give feedback, they often have better buy-in for the process that you're bringing in. So ways that you can consult are, you might have a health and safety committee meeting, so you can bring it up there. Team meetings, toolbox meetings, even on email, if you send out a new policy and say, hey guys, this is a new policy we're looking at implementing, can you provide feedback to me within, by Friday? Something along those lines. Even a one-on-one conversation, if you go up to someone and say, this is the policy I'm bringing in place, can you have a read through and give me any feedback if you've got any? Always consider what the workers say and the feedback that they give you, but ultimately it is the PCBU's choice on what policies and procedures they bring into place, as long as they're reasonably practicable. But you should always consider your workers' input. And like I said before, you're going to improve your safety culture if they're involved in those processes as well. So we should be consulting with workers on our policies and procedures, on any changes on our safe work method statements, risk assessments, all those types of things. Even after an incident, if we're doing an incident investigation, we should have some workers involved there so they can help bring up, what they believe the causes were for the incident, what they believe will help it from not occurring again. So consultation and communication is really important. Inductions. So for a lot of small businesses, the inductions are often missed because, maybe you've got that one-on-one relationship with whoever you're bringing in, but it is still something that is important to have in place for your work. So what you need to look at covering for work health and safety induction are your common risks and hazards in your workplace, special equipment such as PPE, which may be required may require additional training, your safe work practices, go through any relevant legislation, emergency procedures, so show them your emergency evacuation plan, where they need to evacuate, who the wardens are, anything like that. What the fire alarms sound like and your locations, and also the location of your first aid equipment. So this is just the basics that you can have in your safety induction for if you have a new worker starting or a visitor on site or a contractor or anything along those lines. It's a really great way just to have that initial conversation with someone so they understand the processes for your workplace. But again, it is something that is often missed in the smaller businesses. So it would be really great if you do need any help setting up a one-page induction or a quick slideshow, reach out to us and we're more than happy to help you set that up. There's also a lot of induction examples online on Safe Work Australia. So have a look there if you want to have a quick look through an example of what an induction looks like, but this is usually what they include. So training and competency varies significantly depending on the industry, but a general way of understanding what training needs are needed in your workplace is by conducting a training needs analysis. And you can see in this picture here, you've got questionnaires, observation interviews, examining work assessments, and competitive analysis. So there are a lot of ways to understand what training is required for the work that they are doing. So I've just put some examples on the side here for work health and safety. So manual handling is a really big one. If you've got any manual labour that's occurring in your workplace, manual handling is great training that you should undertake for your workers. Ergonomics, so that's great for offices and even manual handling environments. Lockout, tag out when you're in a manufacturing, mining, construction industry to lock out your hazards. Take 5 in JSRA, which also marries up there with risk assessment. So if your workers are performing risk assessments, taking them through training on how to do that. Chemical handling training. Again, these are just some examples. So it could completely depend on what industry that you're involved in and working in. But when you have trained people or you understand that they need to have training, you can outsource it. You could get TCCI to run it. You could do it internally. You just need to have a process in place for tracking what training they need and when it's been completed and when it's overdue. So, you know, there might be a first aider, which say expires in 3 years' time. So you put in their date that they've completed it, and in 3 years' time, they'll need to redo it again. For internal training, you might choose to do manual handling every year. You might choose to do it every 2 years. Again, it depends on the training needs for your business. And again, it's something that we can help you do a training needs analysis with if you wish for that. Workplace inspections. So I really encourage workplace inspections to be involved in every business. So you're legally required to take reasonably practicable steps to ensure safety, which means that there is no respective requirements for the number or timing of inspections. It will vary depending on the nature of your work. So a work health and safety inspection can be really simple. You can do it once a month, you can do it once a quarter, and it just needs to go through the basic work health and safety requirements for your industry. So on the next slide, I've got an example that we've got at TCCI. So this is one that we run through with businesses free of charge. So the first section here is fire. So the first question, are extinguishers available and easily accessible? So you go around, you look for your extinguishers, yes, no, not applicable. Are they within inspection timeframe? You know, so you go through these questions, and again, we can share this template with anybody, but you can also find plenty of them online. And an inspection is a good proactive way to find if there are any issues that you may have just forgotten. Maybe you've just forgotten that your extinguishers are due for an inspection. Or maybe you've forgotten under electrical safety that your test and tags overdue for the last 3 months. You do your inspection and you find, oh, we need to make sure we get that done. With your, because sometimes those things just get forgotten. There's so many things you need to remember with your first aid, you know, fire, electrical safety, manual handling, ergonomics. It's easy to forget exactly when things are due, and an inspection is a proactive way to find them before something actually happens. So you'd rather that than someone sitting at their desk and they get a mild electrocution because the test and tag's out of date. You'd rather do an inspection and find it well before anything like that happens. So if you do want the TCCI to run through an inspection with you, we do it free of charge all over Tasmania. So contact me if you'd like to organise one of those. Also, we can help set one up for you as well. Risk assessment. So risk assessment also has its own training session. They vary depending on the industry. What's really important as a business owner, manager, supervisor is that you have a general understanding of what a risk assessment is, what your hazards are, and how you're controlling them. So here on this slide, we've just got a couple examples of hazards. So chemicals, ladders, so working at heights, vehicles, electrical, you know, water, so being slippery, falling objects. These are all examples of hazards, and depending on your workplace, you'll have varying ones. There's also a code of practice on how to manage work health and safety risks. So I suggest you have a read through that if you're not too familiar with how to perform a risk assessment. Again, also stay online and we can organise some risk assessment training as well. But this is straight out of the codes of practice, and these are the most used tools that I look at when doing a risk assessment. So see how around the circle there you've got consultation. So when you're performing a risk assessment, you want to make sure all stakeholders are in place. So it's not much use a manager doing it from their desk, not involving anybody. You want to go over to where the equipment is, to the people that operate it, to the manager in the area, and do the risk assessment all as a group, because that's the way you're going to be finding all the relevant hazards and identifying them. So step 1's identify, step 2 is assess the risk, which is on the next slide in more detail. Step 3 is control, and step 4 is review. So for step 1, you're identifying what the hazard is. So we might have a hazard of electricity, for example. Step 2 would be to assess the risk, which is, here's an example of a risk matrix tool. Risk matrix tools vary, so this is just one that I found online, but basically what they're designed to do is to understand the likelihood and consequence of a risk occurring. So likelihood is the probability that something might happen, and the consequence or severity is defined as the most probable result of the potential incident. So it depends on your, how often you're around the hazard, but basically your likelihood, this will be in your policy and procedure that you create for your business, but likelihood 1 might be very unlikely or never, rare. 2 might be very unlikely. 3 might be likely or possible. 4 is likely, and then 5 is almost certain. So that's how you would roughly scale your matrix. And then for severity, 1 might be first aid, so a band-aid, a paper cut. 2 might be mild medical treatment. 3 might be hospital medical treatment. 4 might be an LTI, so lost time injury. You've had to miss work for your industry injury, and 5 might be fatality. So you go up the scale. The higher up you go, the more severe it is. And this is how you gauge your risk assessment. And this is when you go back to your reasonably practicable. You've got to first assess your risk. So how high is the risk? If it's low, what's reasonable in the low category for your business to do? If it's extreme, what's reasonable? Because obviously you might need to be spending more money to ensure that you're eliminating this risk in the workplace. Also, once you've figured out in your risk assessment what risk level you're dealing with, you'll then go back to your codes of practice on the right-hand side here, where you've got your levels, which are the hierarchy of controls. So first and foremost, you should try and eliminate a risk. So if you've got a toxic chemical that you're using at work, you've got risk of chemical burns, etc. Level 1 way of getting rid of the risk is to eliminate the use of the chemical completely, right? So if you can do that, that's great. And if you can't, you would then go down to level 2, which is substitute the hazard with a safer alternative, or isolate from people, or reduce the risk through engineering controls. So examples would be, you've got your highly corrosive chemical, maybe you're substituting it for a lower risk chemical. So maybe it's alcohol 70%, like sanitizer. Or an engineering control would be to have it plumbed through, so it just comes out the wall and you can fill your jug up, for example, instead of walking around and handling a highly corrosive chemical. Level 3, and this is the lowest, is to have admin controls, so signage, training, things like that, and also PPE. So again, with this corrosive chemical example, you would have, safety glasses, face shield, apron, gloves, boots, the works. But do you see how a level 1 control is where you should always start? And if it's practicable, reasonably practicable, that's what you should do. If you can't, you move down and down and down the line until you get your best control that you can put in place. So again, if you want to read more about this, have a look at the codes of practice on the Safe Work Australia website. And if you haven't already, look into creating your risk matrix for your workplace. Again, we're more than happy to help you do that as well. So I thought we would go through just a couple examples if no one has had much involved in risk assessments previously. Is that a question?
Oh, no.
No, doesn't sound like it. So this photo here, I've just circled one of the hazards in this photo, but you've got what looks to be a lady that's got a kettle plugged into the wall and, you know, electrical hazard and water. So water and electricity generally don't mix. Here we've got our hazard. So, sorry, I'll just mute. Here we've got the hazard is electrical down the bottom. Description, filling up kettle with water while connected to electricity. So this is when you go back to your consequence and likelihood. So I've said it's a pretty high consequence because you're potentially looking at a fatality here. How likely is it? Well, it's about a 3 out of 5 because it's pretty likely that she could electrocute herself here. Your risk is always time, so 4 times 3. So that's a high risk. What controls can you put in place to make that less of a risk? You could unplug the kettle from electricity prior to filling it up with water. That's one example. You could also not put the kettle under the water. You could get a jug and fill it up or something along those lines. This is just to put a risk assessment example out there for you to see. And one other example I've put on here is this one. So you've got an employee walking up a ladder. The hazard would be fall from height. And the reason it is a hazard is because the ladder is not on a flat surface. You can see he's chopped it up with a piece of wood. And it's also not secure. So it's not secured in place. There's no one at the bottom holding the ladder, or there's no rope at the top securing the ladder in place. So that could easily slip and fall, and that person would fall from the ladder. So again, I've just put the consequences for likelihood 3, so 12 again. And some controls that you can put in place is place the ladder on a flat surface, secure in place, maybe some fall arrest, working at heights equipment, and that's going to reduce your risk score at the end. These are just examples of risk assessments. So again, if you're interested, we can go through further training on that, but this is just to make it a bit more visual. What should also come out of your risk assessment, and it is a level 3 control, any PPE that would be required for the work that you're doing under your risk assessment. So chemicals, you might be using the gloves, face shield, apron, boots. COVID's a great example at the moment, right? Everyone's wearing face masks, or they have been wearing face masks to protect themselves from that hazard. Noise, so if you've got a noisy environment, you'd be wearing hearing protection. This would be in a risk assessment. Falling objects, if they're not heavy objects, maybe you'd just be wearing a hard hat. So these are a couple examples of PPE. And again, it should be falling out of the risk assessment that you're doing at work anyway. So that's just the basics on PPE. Just a quick one on electrical safety. So as a general, this is out of the Australian standards. So it depends on the environment that you are in, but you need to get your equipment tested and tagged in the workplace. And what varies is the time frame there. So factories, workshops, places of work for repair, manufacturing, assembly, maintenance, fabrication. It gives you a time frame on how often those should be tested and tagged in the workplace. A lot of electrical companies do test and tag work. It is something that you need to ensure is getting done at your workplace, because electricity is not a hazard that you want to mess with at all. And again, there's a bunch of Tasmanian electricians that do test and tagging equipment. So this is just a general overview of the requirements for that. How am I going for time? 40 minutes, that's what I was trying to get it in on under. So at the end of that, like I said, everything that we covered, we can provide further training on each topic. But basically, if you as a business would just like a general idea of where you're sitting at the moment with your work health and safety management system, we can provide you with a work health and safety diagnostic audit tool. We can do it online. We can come face to face and meet you at your workplace and do the audit. And we can also help you set up your work health and safety on-site inspection, so we can come out, inspect your workplace and look for any opportunities there. Or we can look